Vidcover's first case study is what you see here. It's a small church in the city of Rimini, Italy, on the Adriatic coast. It was originally a 13th century Gothic structure, so belonged to an entirely different stylistic and cultural moment. The structure, named San Francesco, in other words, St. Francis, was run by the Franciscan order. And since the 19th century, it's been known as the Tempio Malatestiano, after the man you also see, Sigismondo Malatesta. He was an extraordinary character. This is a portrait by Piero della Francesca from about 1451. Malatesta was a Renaissance nobleman who became Lord Rimini at the age of 14 and became its sole ruler after abolishing the authority of his brothers. He was a notorious despot and politically savvy vis-a-vis much more powerful city-states. And this earned him actually a temporary spot as commander-in-chief of the nothing less than the papal armies. Eventually, the Vatican was going to turn against him, going so far as to condemn him to hell for the rest of his lifetime. This was obviously not commissioned at this moment. The church was essentially a reconstruction of the original structure. And it dates from about the time of Piero's portrait, from about 1450. The archival evidence is scanty, which in many ways makes this a perfect case study for Vidcover, who's less interested in those historical documents. It's not clear, for example, when Alberti came on board, nor what requirements there were for the design. What they were meant to be like. Was a dome part of the equation? Or how the relationship played out between Alberti as designer and his forceful patron, along with the builder in question, Matteo de Pasti. What we do know is that in addition to making detailed drawings, Alberti had a wooden model made. This is lost today. And a good part of the facade was up by 1454, so work progressed rather quickly. It's important to underscore that this was Alberti's very first Ecclesiastical Commission. The patron's aim was to turn the church of St. Francis into a mausoleum for himself and his wife, so it had a kind of personal commemorative function. It's an unfinished project. You can see this by the picture of the facade. There was perhaps a projected dome, which was supposed to be hemispherical, and it's a shape that was meant, therefore, to mimic the Pantheon in Rome, and therefore allude to the classical past in a very grandiose way. That dome was never built, and Alberti's facade was never finished. This is in large part because of the question of the patron. The patron's fortunes went awry. He was actually excommunicated in 1460, so a mere 6 years after the facade was for the most part erected, and he died in 1468. Now, if you look at the facade, you'll see that to either side of the entrance there are two blind arcades. We know that these were originally meant to house a sarcophagus for Malatesta as well as another one for his wife, although there's some disagreement about this. But the idea adds consistency to the explanation offered by Vidcover of a united whole, of a united monumental and commemorative purpose for the whole. What's interesting here is to do what Vidcover didn't do, to think about the context of this. For example, the Pope at the time thought this was a blasphemous structure, a blasphemous idea. He decided that to plaster a classical facade on this church, to turn it into an evocation of the Pantheon, was actually turning the church into something that was, quote, and this is the Pope himself, full of pagan gods and profane things, so full of pagan images that it seems like a temple for the worshippers of demons. This is obviously a conflicted commission. Again, Vidcover is not interested in these issues. What he sees in the Tempio is the first in a sequence of 4 churches in which Alberti is carrying out a systematic investigation of the fusion of classical system or classical principles in Christian buildings. The building poses a problem, and he offers a certain kind of answer or solution. So problem 1. The Tempio, or how to impose a classical aspect onto or over a pre-existing medieval structure. How do you do that? Alberti's answer is to introduce to the facade a variation on the Roman triumphal arch, while reconceiving of the entire envelope of the building as an antique temple, almost putting a classical box around the whole structure. This is the first isolated church facade to do this in the Renaissance, and this is why it's such an important example. It started a trend, in other words. And in Wittkover's words, Alberti was grafting the idea of the triumphal arch right up onto the wall. So given the patron's demands, this actually makes sense. It's a clever response, the idea of the triumph over death. And you have a triple arch motif on the facade with the central arch over the door and side arches for the sarcophagi. You get a sense of what this pantheon effect would have been like when you look at the side of the church. Both sides offered a deep arcade. Think back to the Colosseum here. This deep arcade was based on a pillar and arch construction. You have pillars and you have arches springing from them. This is actually a form of construction that stems from ancient Roman aqueducts. Now, Malatesta planned to have the sarcophagi of the sort of illustrious men, the poets, the artists, the scholars of his court, inserted into the deep recesses offered by the arches. Now, if you look at the plan, you'll notice that the original church, conveniently, has a rectangular format. It's a medieval church with a single nave and no side aisles, extending into a large semicircular apse. Now, part of Alberti's plan was to transform this basically simple and straight rectangle by means of a large rotunda that would support a massive dome at the crossing. The nave was meant to be covered over by a barrel vault made of timber, and over this, a pitched roof over the side chapels and the nave. One of the things you'll notice about the plan is that the windows are actually unevenly distributed at the sides. And Alberti screens this asymmetry, if you will, with the Roman arches held up by piers, and the whole, as it were, is elevated on a kind of antique-style podium. He's, in other words, putting his own theory into practice. If we turn to Alberti's own theoretical treatise, in his book 7 on sacred buildings, he writes, quote, "In my opinion, the space taken up by the portico, and indeed the whole temple, should be raised above the level of the city. This will give it a greater air of dignity." This idea of elevating the church, of placing it on a podium, of making it function as the sacred center of an urban context. You see the podium effect here. What remains of Alberti's design is most visible actually on the outside rather than on the interior. And you also can gather the repercussions of what it means to impose a triumphal arch idea on a church facade. The other important aspect of all of this is that his classical source was local. It's what you see, the arch of the Roman emperor, Augustus. What Alberti is doing here is that he's playing with classical motifs. He's not copying them verbatim. He keeps the roundels of the arch, he transposes them onto the facade, as well as the relation of the arch, the fluted engaged columns, and the spandrel. The spandrel is actually the space between a curved element and a rectangular boundary. And then he places a triangular pediment over the door, inside of the arch on the facade rather than above it, as you see in the actual arch. The capitals are in the spirit of Anticomenia and in the playfulness that we see with Wittkover, completely his invention. Now, for Wittkover, Alberti's approach to architecture is to create a series of problems to solve. The first challenge is that a triumphal arch is essentially a one-story structure. But when a church facade has to screen a very high central nave between the chapels or lower aisles to either side, the screen needs to be a two-story structure. So how do you transform a triumphal arch, which is a one-story structure, into a two-story structure to mask the entirety of the church? You're faced, as an architect, with the problem of extending a one-story system to a two-story system. There were Venetian precedents for this. They were Byzantine and Gothic, such as St. Mark's in Venice, or the Frari. So when Alberti tries to plaster a classical system on this, what Wittkower does is to engage in a kind of game to reconstruct what Alberti's intentions were. He surmises the elements of the facade and the composition of the facade that were never completed, but must, if you follow Wittkower's logic, have aimed for unity in its classical scheme. There's a key piece of evidence in the story. It's a medal by sculptor and medalist Matteo de Pasti, who collaborated with Alberti on the design and the construction of the church. That medal shows a huge hemispherical dome, low curved walls placed above a heavily articulated entablature over the side bays. What the medal reveals is a fully elaborated second-story arch over the central bay, above the entrance, and it's clearly articulated as a small shrine, what we call an edicula, with a window divided into 3 parts, sitting in the niche, and the whole is crowned by a floral motif. We see the legacy of this idea in Venice, in a monastery church of San Michele in Isola. The evidence is that in 1454, Alberti actually changed his mind and switched the curved walls of the upper part for straight sloping walls decorated with large scrolls. Still, ultimately, Alberti's scheme reveals a classically derived system on the lower story and essentially a kind of medieval concept above, despite the classical details. By classicism, it's important to underscore that I don't mean some generic notion of the classic, but that we're referring very specifically to the Greco-Roman past of Western civilization. Now, for Italian Renaissance architects, this really meant ancient Rome, not Greece. Italian architects did not go to ancient Greece. They did not see the Acropolis firsthand. But what they had around them, surrounding them, in Florence, in Rome, were the remnants of Republican and imperial Rome, the Pantheon, the Colosseum. Problem number 2. How the entablature, at the point at which it projects above each column, confounds the attempt to coordinate the lower story with the upper story. And this is where the work of the diagram comes in. What Wittkower is demonstrated in his schematization of the facade is an attempt to resolve the contradiction of the lower story with the upper story. On the one hand, the composition as a whole is rigorously faithful to Alberti's theory of architecture. Remember that for him, columns were decorative, and here the columns remain, in principle, the decoration of the facade, following his sense that the column needed to be ornamental and not structural. This is Alberti, quote, "The principal ornament in all architecture certainly lies in the column." While on the side of the building, as we saw, the wall is aligned with a pillar arch construction. He derives the design of the sides from the facade, but strips the sides of the columns. That's one side of the story. On the other hand, there's what Wittkower is showing with his diagram, with his lines, which actually have different weight if you look at them. What his diagram foregrounds is actually a series of disrupted rhythms, which come from his assessment of the visual essence of the element. The entablatures should, by all logic, create a horizontal barrier between the lower register and above. The interesting thing is that you also expect a vertical continuation, and that's what you see in the central bay with the entrance and that niche or edicula above it. This part accentuates the verticality of the building, not the horizontality of the building. What happens here is that fundamentally we are left with a contradiction. While the central vertical thrust remains apparent, it is challenged, according to Wittkower, by the high base, that podium on which all of the columns rest, as well as the side bays, which emphasize a horizontal aspect to the facade. You can see him drawing the lines in bold to emphasize this contradictory state, to prove his point. The result for Vitkover is that the outer bays are closed off by the common base that links them, but left open at the top. There's nothing above them. There's nothing that closes them off. And according to Vitkover, exactly the opposite happens in the central bay, where there is no podium linking the two central columns, but their verticality is emphasized. Ultimately, for Vitkover, these complicated rhythms of the Tempio's facade leave its quote-unquote unity completely unresolved. And this is the point of the diagram, to show us in the most distilled way possible that Alberti's daring, imaginative, but ultimately failed project was an attempt to resolve two incompatible systems. What does it mean to put a classical envelope on a medieval structure? What does it mean to impose a one-story logic taken from the Roman triumphal arch and impose it on a structure that required a two-story solution? Ultimately, the diagram demonstrates Alberti's attempt to capture an ideal formula.